on types of terrorism. That kind of gets us more into maybe present-day terrorism, because obviously during the 1940s, or before that, terrorists weren't going to have nuclear capabilities. So, present-day terrorism, we obviously have more single-issue terrorism arising, like anti-abortion terrorism and eco-terrorism. In the Middle East, terrorism is separated by a few different parties. First is Hezbollah. Does anyone know where Hezbollah originated? Yeah.
Palestine.
No, actually.
Really? So I know they were on.
It's actually Lebanon. They originated in during the civil war in Lebanon in 1982. Hezbollah was inspired by Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution. They pretty much originally saw Islamic revolution in Lebanon during the Civil War, and they wanted Israel to withdraw from Lebanon. The group kidnapped a lot of Israeli soldiers during this time, carried out missile attacks, suicide bombings against Israeli military and civilian targets. You can obviously see where terrorism has continued and how they get their ideas. Where did I say civilian targets were first used? Christian?
That was the Irgun, whatever.
Yeah, Irgun, which was an Israeli group who inspired an alternate faction of Islamist terrorists to do the same thing against Israeli civilians. Terrorism builds on itself. People get ideas from previous terrorists. So this group continues and actually has major control of certain governments now. Not considered as scary as they used to be because they're, I guess, doing attacks under the radar if they exist now. Something else you want to look into is the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. They're a very militant, sure. Yes. This group still exists. They're in a lot of political parties in this region, like Egypt. Their first goal was to establish an Islamic state in Egypt. They formed in 1980 and were mainly composed of militant student groups. This organization came into power or was established after the Muslim Brotherhood renounced violence during the 1980s. Muslim Brotherhood was attempting to gain political traction in those areas, so they were trying to make their face a little less scary so people would jump on board. A lot of terrorist groups ultimately learned that most of the population is not interested in supporting you if you killed their families. So once the Muslim Brotherhood attempted to gain more political traction, student groups who were part of the Muslim Brotherhood broke off and created the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. I talked about this phenomenon before, about how political parties start or terrorist groups start. If they begin to become a little more pacifist in their goals, a lot of factions break off and attempt to continue the violent goals that they had before. This group was led by a student named Omar Abdel Rahman. Does anyone, or has anyone learned about the 1993 World Trade Center bombings? Yeah, World Trade Center was attacked numerous times before, I'm just seeing a poll, numerous times before 2001. One of these examples was 1993. And he was actually, Omar Rahman was accused of being part of the 1993 World Trade Center bombings. In 1981, this group did one of their most famous acts of terrorists. They assassinated the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat. That's something you want to keep in mind. These are all examples that you can use in debate about how terrorism has existed. Yes, Christian?
What year was that?
1981.
You all see the relevance of these historical anecdotes, right? It's good discussion when you're talking about whether or not terrorism actually happened. And these historical anecdotes, when we talk about this, people categorize thinking in their heads that when they hear something new, they try something they remember. So those kind of anecdotes, historical anecdotes, are good warrant work for why terrorism could happen.
Yeah. It's also key to understand these examples and how the international sphere reacted to these acts of terrorism. 1981, assassination of Anwar Sadat created like a global, pretty much upheaval in international relations where no one was sure how they were going to treat Egypt. No one was sure what was going to happen to the government. Creates a lot of political upheaval, not only in that nation, but in all of the nations that surround it and all of their political allies or enemies. Another example, and this is kind of when airplane bombing became popular. I'm trying to like drill it into your heads that September 11th was not the first example of major terrorist catastrophes, nor was it the first example of terrorists using airplanes. In 1988, a Libyan citizen, his name is Abdel Basset al-Magrani, you don't really need to know how to spell that, I barely know how to say it, was convicted of bombing a flight called Pan Am 103. Pan Am went down in the Scottish Ocean area and was the first major example of an airplane attack. You can kind of understand why airplanes would be so significant for terrorist actions, just because it creates a lot of not only like media attention, but it's also very dangerous towards anyone who's kind of in the line of flight when airplanes are going down or being attacked. Okay. Another example, I talked about this at the beginning with Madi Lou's example of suicide bombing, is suicide bombing. It becomes very integral to terrorist actions as you get into the present day history of terrorism. The first suicide attack that I guess I'm talking about in the present day is a Palestinian suicide attack in 1989. A member of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad ignited a bomb on board a Tel Aviv bus. This example continued and inspired many more instances of suicide attacks. Why would you think that a suicide bomber would choose that tactic? Anybody? Jack?
Because it shows sort of like an ultimate dedication to that one cause. Like,
exactly.
hey, I'm going to blow myself up for this.
Martyrdom is something a lot of people can, I guess, jump on board with. If you're willing to put your own life on the line for your cause, it, one, portrays a lot of media attention from the oppositional groups, but people are like, oh my gosh, this guy killed himself. Why? That why is the ultimate reason terrorists use terrorist actions. They want people to know why, because that instills more fear. Will they do more actions? That allows for a lot of control in the international sphere. People are afraid of you.
This sort of like public suicide is an important thing to think about, because individuals willing to kill themselves over a cause really does gain a lot of media publicity. That is how there's a recent revolution that started this way.
Yes.
Does anyone know? Anybody else? Camille. Somebody did.
The Egyptian Revolution.
Right, right. When that happened in Egypt, the whole international community looked up and was like, what is going on in Egypt? Okay, these things get a lot of attention with terrorism and with things like revolutions. Like people notice these things. It creates a rally point. Certain instances like this creates a rally point for people.
Yeah, and you also have to understand that many reactions to terrorism are kind of what you would think unexpected. Oftentimes, obviously, the United States is very aggressive towards terrorism, usually when it threatens them. But a lot of times, the United States jumps on board and supports a terrorist group because they think that that terrorist group is much more unlikely to incite global political upheaval or, I guess, threats against the United States. Can anyone think of instances where we supported a terrorist group?
Supported the Taliban.
Yes, we supported the Taliban. We gave them weapons. We allowed them to gain control over that region. And what happened maybe 10 years later or far down the road? Maybe a couple decades, anyone know?
They backstabbed us.
9/11? Yeah, 9/11, and what did we do? We fought against the Taliban. We were probably fighting or being killed by our own weapons that we provided them. Something to keep in mind. Probably not good to support terrorist groups, but the next example I'm going to give is an Israeli-based terrorist group that exists much more now. They're called the Koch, spelled K-A-C-H. Their most known member was Baruch Goldstein. He was born in America and was a physician, not what you would expect a terrorist job to be, but he was actually a very profitable physician who did a massacre on a place called the Cave of Patriarchs, which was a mosque in the city of Hebron in 1994. He killed between 30 and 54 Muslim worshippers inside the Abrahimi Mosque.
How are they not sure how many people got killed?
Because they're not sure who was worshiping at that time. They don't have like church attendance rules like a lot of like I guess Christian churches do. They let anyone come worship in the mosque. So this example kind of started another huge political upheaval in how Muslim-Israeli relations were working and how this was becoming a lot more violent. Something to think about and how this has continued until now, in the present time. Now we're getting to someone much more known to you all, Osama bin Laden. He and Ayman al-Zawahiri founded Al-Qaeda in 1988. This group still obviously has a lot of power traction in the international sphere. They began as an Islamic jihadist movement to replace Western-controlled or dominated Muslim countries with Islamic fundamentalist regimes. Does anyone want to sum up what that means for me, besides Jack? No offense. Come on. I'm just going to pick somebody.
Repeat the question.
Can you sum up Al-Qaeda's original intent? I'll do it. Christian, good.
Their main goal was to establish Islamic control in places that should be Islamically controlled. That was their history.
Yeah, sure. They wanted to make sure that Islamic nations weren't controlled by Western ideals, but instead by fundamentalist Islamic ideals. The first example of their, violent actions was in the 1996 manifesto that bin Laden wrote that vowed violent jihad against the U.S. military forces in Saudi Arabia. And in 1988, a lot of individuals associated with Al-Qaeda carried out a lot of bombings on U.S. embassies in Africa. That was actually one of the examples that was in the 1 to 10 most dangerous terrorist attacks, the African embassy attack. You have to notice that African embassy attack killed people of many different political ideologies, not just Americans who were there. It was in Africa. Most of the bodies you saw being carried out of that embassy were African natives. You kind of see how the end result is simply to gain political media portrayal of your act. It's not really, they don't care who they kill. So that's something to keep in mind. But this attack also led to a 2000 attack in 2000 on the USS Cole. This was a suicide bombing of a Navy destroyer. Does anyone know where it was when it got attacked? We're leading off of an African embassy attack.
I think it was in port somewhere in Africa or South America.
Yeah, it was in Yemen. It was the port of Aden where it got attacked. It killed 17 sailors and many other people, connected to the attack. But continuing on, the group's most popular attack is what all of you understand as maybe present-day terrorism, which was September 11th. Now, Middle Eastern terrorism obviously isn't the only kind that exists. There is terrorism all over the globe. The next area I'm going to look at is Asian terrorism. The most well-known Asian terrorist group is called the Aleph. They're a Japanese religious group that was established in the 90s. They were the first group to attempt to use biological warfare. They used botulinum toxin and anthrax to attack like a lot of neighborhoods in Japan. Ultimately, although they desired a major attack, it killed 8 people and did not escalate to major warfare.
What was the name of that group again?
It's the Aleph, spelled A-L-E-P-H.
A-L-E-P-H?
Yes. The incident that killed 8 people was a use of sarin gas that they actually used, or I guess sent out of several sites in a certain neighborhood in Matsumoto, but was not ultimately successful in the way they wanted it to be. They did a second sarin attack on trains in Tokyo, which killed 12 people. So that's a use of a historical example of how you can say biological or chemical terrorism doesn't escalate. We even saw this in the anthrax attacks that happened in the United States in the Postal Service, where yes, it killed the person who came direct contact, but did not ultimately lead to an escalation of death or of, I guess, political retribution. Russian terrorism is also very common now. Does anyone know the major Russian terrorist group that exists? I really hope so, because people talk about them a lot in debate.
The Chechen rebels? Or
Yes. The Chechen rebels started as a group of separatists led by Shamil Basiev. They've been in power since 1994 as a terrorist group and have done a lot of attacks on targeted Russian political leaders or just areas in Russia. They're very highly involved now in the Russian government, which is something to keep in mind with maybe how our relations are with Russia and why we're a little afraid of them. Which leads to North American terrorism. Some more examples of airport or airplane terrorism happened in 1985, where a group of militants in Canada attacked the Air India Flight 182. This was an airport bombing in Canada, which actually had the biggest terrorist death toll before 9/11. A lot of witnesses connect this terrorist act with another airliner attack that happened a couple hours later. This group was mainly said that their attacks were because of the actions of Canada punishing India for attacking the Golden Temple. The next example was the United States terrorist attack, which happened in 1995. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? This has come back into play a little bit recently for
Oklahoma City.
Yeah, Oklahoma City bombing by a guy named McVeigh. He was executed for this action, and his motivation was set to be revenge on the U.S. government actions at Waco and Review Ridge. This is another example you can see that is not religiously based, it's politically based. Another reason, a major reason that terrorists do what they do are for political ideas that are mainly subsets of anarchy, which is something Kyle talked about in his speech, where you are anti-government and are trying to take down the government. Anthrax attacks, I just talked about this earlier, was in 2011. It was the first act of bioterrorism in the United States with anthrax. Does anyone actually remember these attacks? This is like 11 years ago, so you were like 5. Not even. Okay. I feel so old. But yeah, these attacks kind of caused a domestic scare to where no one knew who did these attacks at the time. No one was sure what was going to happen. I remember my dad works for the post office, so my mom was so scared every time he went to work, because most of the people that ultimately came in contact with the anthrax were the mail carriers. So we were afraid for my dad's safety every time he left the house. Nothing happened though, he's okay. but this was something that you can ultimately see what happened. Not a lot of people died, but everyone was affected from the fear mentality that arose because of the attacks. Now, after knowing about a lot of terrorism, people ask, well, what are we doing about it? How are we going to keep this from happening? Something you want to look into are current anti-terrorist initiatives or counterterrorism. Because when people talk about terrorism in debate, maybe what they're talking about doesn't have as much of an impact because we're doing stuff to solve for it. That's how you might want to answer terrorism. After 9/11, we obviously started the war on terror to try to combat terrorism. I ultimately think it's probably caused more instances of terror than it's solved for, but everyone has a different opinion. Where did we invade? Everyone should know this. Christian? We, October 7, 2001, invaded Afghanistan to depose the Taliban because we believe that they harbored the Al-Qaeda terrorists. On about 2 weeks later, we enacted a very important piece of legislation to combat terrorism. Does anyone know what it is called? Stacy.
I've talked about this before this week.
Something everyone
In the
should
power
know.
relations
Because
letter,
it
I
affects
talked about
your
it.
rights.
I said a bunch of people in the debate community got in trouble for the things they were checking out of the library. Remember that conversation?
Patriot Act.
Yeah, the Patriot Act. Does anyone know what this legislation was? Jamila?
Oh, it allowed people to tap our phones to check our mail and all personal things we were allowed to.
Yeah. It was legislation that ultimately just expanded the powers of U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies. What a lot of people say is bad because the government is always watching you now. You never have any privacy. If you say the word terrorism and a couple other words when you're on a phone conversation, it gets tapped so they can hear what you're saying. All scary stuff that comes from that. I'm going to keep moving on, Jack. So.
Okay, that's just really not accurate for all of it.
Probably not. Something else that happened during this time was that a certain governmental agency was created. Does anyone want to take a hack at what it was?
Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah. So, Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, you'll have it called a lot in debates, was established to consolidate a lot of the domestic security agencies that existed at that time and coordinate anti-terrorist measures to be able to respond to national disasters and accidents. An act that kind of limited domestic deployment of the U.S. Army was the, I don't even know how to pronounce this, the Posse Comitatus Act.
Wait, let's do it.
No. Which required presidential approval before you deploy an army. Kind of to keep Congress from just deciding that we're going to deploy our army somewhere. The president has to approve it first. And then the final thing I want you to understand about is a law that requires external or international use of lethal force would require a presidential finding. So basically, Bush wanted to make sure that presidents, in response to terrorism, had a lot of control over how our policies were enacted. Some other counter-terrorist measures are ideas of how we should combat terrorism. This is kind of a second stage of our anti-terrorist initiatives. The first thought was that we should tighten security, or security tightening measures. This, a lot of times, has intense debate over how this affects human rights, or how it abuses human rights. One example of security tightening measures that you will talk a lot about in debate is Guantanamo Bay. Does anyone know what goes on, or everyone should know? Please, everyone raise your hand.
Everyone should know what's happening.
Monica.
Torture.
Yeah, a lot of people say torture is happening there, so we can have interrogation. We're detaining people so that we can assess whether or not they're a terrorist threat or whether they know about certain terrorist threats. So security tightening measures also often...
Gitmo is where we're holding the majority of our suspects in the war on terror.
Yes.
Okay. And so that's where we're using the suspects that we have there to see what other information we can glean from them. Okay. Gitmo was largely created, or I should say resurgence of Gitmo, since the Patriot Act.
Now, a second example of how we can fight terrorism, which is gaining a lot of traction in how maybe you can see this from Osama bin Laden and other examples, are preemptive attacks, where we capture, kill, or disable suspected targets or terrorists before they can mount an attack. This is a lot of the ideology behind GitMo and why we capture them, because we believe that detaining them keeps them from ultimately being able to participate in certain terrorist regimes.
Yeah, for example, the information we got for where Osama was gotten from somebody who was in Guantanamo Bay.
Yep.
Also, I'll call everybody to people.
Sure. Another instance of terrorist countermeasures is non-military initiatives against terrorism. Does anyone, I assume a lot of people have heard about the Winning the Hearts and Minds campaign that's happening a lot in like Middle Eastern nations, where we give them food, create better educational facilities, stuff like that, so the U.S. has a better face to a lot of nations so that we can gain cooperation. This is more of a human security paradigm, so that you identify causal factors of why terrorism happens or why people jump on board with terrorism. A big example in Afghanistan are the fact that a lot of maybe farmers in that area, one example are poppy farmers, are very controlled by the Taliban in that region, because the Taliban takes a lot of their money and kind of either keeps them from dying or keeps them in a certain state of impoverishment or the opposite of. So a lot of people fear breaking away from the Taliban in that region, because they're like, that's how I get money to feed my family. That if I break away, they're going to find me and they're going to kill me. A lot of people become terrorists not because they believe in the ideology, but they believe that they're going to die if they don't become a part of the ideology. I'm just going to keep talking, Jack. There's really no one to reach for me. So the activities of non-military actions are more to provide a freedom from that fear or a freedom from want, which is why we give people money or educational facilities in these regions. During my first debate topic, which was the Middle Eastern topic on how we should have Middle Eastern policies, a big debate was that we should provide like Afghani farmers with different means to have a living so that they wouldn't be impoverished. They wouldn't have to resort to cooperating with terrorists. The final aspect is obviously military.
Sure. The other element there that's crucial is that the drug ring that exists in all these places is used to support terrorism and vice versa. So there is a very strong causal effect between drug lords and terrorism, and that's another reason why that's so big in Afghanistan, because their poppy fields are the largest producer of opium, which is a very expensive, highly addictive drug, and so a lot of the money that's being used in that drug market is used to fund terrorist organizations.
Yeah. Off of that avenue, that's the word. Military countermeasures against terrorism are obviously very popular as well. A little less popular than they were during the Bush administration, because Obama has initiated a lot of winning the hearts and minds non-military campaigns, which are obviously still enacted by the military, but it's not use of force. And that's the key example. Use of force is very popular in targeting terrorism, because terrorism oftentimes justifies military intervention, i.e. 2001 terrorist attacks justified intervention in Afghanistan, justifies intervention in nations like Pakistan and Iran, where terrorists are said to be based. People think that you should fight fire with fire, obviously, so that's kind of one of the reactions to terrorism. It's important to keep in mind when you think about what the international or U.S. policies would be against another terrorist attack, which is what a lot of the debate about terrorism is. It's also very important for policy debaters if you're debating courts affirmative. So a lot of people say that's where terrorists would target the United States, or infrastructure bases. Now we're getting to the part everyone wants to know about. It's going to take me a few more minutes, and that's debating terrorism. I just have a few, suggestions. It's not necessarily too in-depth, because I think we covered that all on the above talks. First, everyone should know where the major terrorist groups are and what they are. There are terrorist groups that function in every single area of the globe. you need to know what their ideology is, why they enact terrorism, and where they're located. Because a lot of times debaters are going to get up and talk about global terrorism as if a certain policy is going to solve for it all. It's not true, because if there are terrorists who are religiously based, you obviously have to target them differently than you would terrorists who are politically based, because they have different end goals, so their means are probably going to be different. Next, you should know their capabilities. Every terrorist organization has a certain amount of money or a certain amount of connection that they have, i.e. Al-Qaeda has many different connections around the globe. They're probably a little more capable of committing a large-scale terrorist attack than a few of the, I guess, like Southern African terrorist organizations are, because they're a little more landlocked. They don't have as much capabilities of expanding outwards. Next, you should know which group that the debaters are talking about. Like I said, don't let them get away with solving for all terrorism, because they're not going to. Don't let them get away with critiquing all of terrorism, because a certain avenue of research is not going to be applying to all terrorism. Next, you should understand the WMD terrorism debate, its capabilities or incapabilities, whether or not it's actually true. We talked about this above. WMD is, anyone want to take a gander? Dave.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction. I would put chemical biological terrorism under here, nuclear terrorism, or major conventional terrorism. Like, we have certain conventional capabilities in the United States. One of them is called like prompt global strike. Yeah, I learned about that a few years ago on the nuclear weapons topic, but those are conventional weapons that are pretty much as effective as nuclear weapons. Next, you should understand how counterterrorism interacts with a debater's position. If a debater is talking about Afghanistan terrorism and how we need to, I guess, ramp up our terrorist countermeasures, you should know how countermeasures are being enacted now. So, a lot of time, you can say the Heart and Minds initiative that's happening in that nation is better than what they're saying we should do. Because sometimes it is. Maybe hearts and minds and getting people to pull away from terrorists so that they have freedom from one is a better initiative than just killing people. Probably true, I think, maybe. Next, and this is 2 more points. The first is research how the U.S. would react to certain instances of terrorism. That's why I gave you a lot of historical background, because understanding how the U.S. reacted to 2001 terrorist attacks, the 1988 bombings, the previous Pentagon bombings are all important to understand what U.S. policies are. History is cyclical. We're probably going to respond in the same way we previously responded. Finally, and this is just a broad category, don't be George Bush. There's a couple instances I have under here. A, not all terrorism is from Muslim groups. You need to know this. People are going to criticize you if you try to attribute all terrorism from Muslim groups. You're probably being a little bigoted if you talk about it that way. Second, people may critique you for simply talking about terrorism scenarios. There's a lot of philosophical literature that says when scenario planning about terrorism, you make it more likely because people understand the power of terrorism and that could achieve a better end goal than maybe diplomatic measures. Finally, don't accuse the other team of being a terrorist. It's going to get you in really bad positions. It happens. Trust me. Like, don't compare other teams to terrorists. Don't compare certain, I guess, political groups as terrorists, unless they actually are terrorists. Be rational about this and reasonable.
Can you accuse their authors of being terrorist sympathizers?
Sympathizers is fine, if you can actually highlight an example.
Right.
A lot of people use this as an ad hom, or ad hominem. Who knows what that is? An ad hominem is when you attack the person's character, not their arguments. So be careful of this because it's very popular when you're debating terrorism. Terrorism is one of my favorite debates when I was in debate because I think it's very important to, I guess, today's international policies, something to know about. I'm done here.
Can I have one more thing?
Sure.
The other thing I think you should be doing when you're debating terrorism is recognizing the type of terrorism that your opponent is talking about, right? You must, this is under what Jackie's talking about, weapons of mass destruction, you must recognize what sort of terrorism they're talking about. If they're talking about conventional terrorism, then you would be silly to read things like, bioweapons attack won't happen. Okay, if they're talking about nuclear terrorism, you respond with, chemical weapons won't happen, you would be silly, right? So you should look through their evidence, understand the context of what type of terrorism it is that they're talking about, and respond in light. If they're just reading generic weapons of mass destruction cards, my suggestion is that you cover your bases and you read no bioterror attack, no chemical terror attack, no nuclear terror attack. Okay, you should make sure that you recognize and flush out what sort of terrorism they're talking about so that you respond with the correct sort of terrorism, right? And I don't think, again, we're trying to focus you all on specificity of your debate. If they just start talking about generic terrorism, I think it's better for you to respond with a more specific type of terrorism, right? A more specific example of why terrorism wouldn't occur in the manner in which they're speaking.
Something to keep in mind, you're obviously going to answer all of these differently. WMD terrorism, all of the historical examples I've given before, like you need to look into that Stratford study, how WMD terrorism won't happen. You can talk about the realism stuff that Kyle talked about before. Like all of these are examples you can give without even evidence. You can just say actors are rational or something like that. Russia's not going to give them WMD because they fear U.S. retaliation. All of those are arguments you can use without cards. I would recommend having them, but that's a key thing to understand.
Also recognize the argument Jackie just mentioned, right? Oh, they're going to get weapons from Russia. You should recognize that there are two different ways for terrorist groups to try to get weapons, right? Number one would be that some other state would sell them to them because they need money, right? So a terrorist group comes to them and says, I'll give you $1 million for this bomb, and they say yes. The second way they would acquire it would be to create it or steal certain products so they can make their own bomb, right? It is possible. So a popular example is like, if Russia would become unstable, then they would have something called loose nukes, or their weapons of mass destruction capabilities would become loose, and so terrorist groups could come in and steal these weapons for them, okay, or at least steal major components of them so they can create them, right? There's a difference between stealing them, creating them, and buying them.
Exactly. Your answers
and those are great cross-X questions, by the way. You're debating terrorism. A very good cross-examination is, okay, what sort of terrorism are you talking about? What terrorist groups are you referring to? Right? If they're reading stuff from like Muslim terrorism, but their advantage is all about Asia, you might be like, well, I don't really understand this. Like, these Muslim terrorist groups come into Asia, or do you think this evidence is talking more about Asian terrorist groups within Asia, right? And the other thing you could start talking about is, well, where do they get the weapons from? That's a really good line of cross-X questioning on terrorist debates.
That's true. And the last thing I would say with WMD terrorism is to talk about how most or all terrorists are probably more likely to want to use conventional terrorism. Because that makes the impact or the reason you would err to the other side much less. Because if they only use conventional terrorism, you can be like, it's just not going to escalate. They're going to have a suicide bombing like they had all the other times before. And that kind of ends that person's ability to enact more terrorism because they just died. So getting onto that is conventional terrorism. One key aspect and reason that I highlighted historical examples is for you to understand how the reaction was to those examples. So when someone talks about conventional terrorism, you can name X historical event did not lead to any escalation. It just kind of stayed isolated in the region it was. The U.S. might have intervened a little militarily, but stopped it in that region. It didn't spill over. The key evaluation for conventional means. Finally, cyber terrorism. Sure.
It's really important to make sure they're getting. The escalation argument, crucial, very important, right? That they're able to contain those things and it doesn't lead to more. And there are two different ways that sort of escalation can happen. It can happen within that area of the original terrorist attack where it just expands, but there's a spillover argument that she mentioned. I want to make sure I highlight that whether or not it would spark other terrorist groups to react in kind, right? That there will be worldwide terrorism so that a bunch of other groups would jump on board while there was some instability in the international relations system and have additional attacks.
Does everyone understand that? How that would work? Okay. So the last one is cyber terrorism. I didn't talk a lot in my previous speech or lecture about cyber terrorism, but I think you need to analyze maybe the effects that the internet and media has on how terrorism functions. Cyber terrorism is new and has continued. One of the fears for cyber terrorism is that terrorists can hack governmental websites and leak out information. Yeah, or accidentally launch one of our weapons. So this kind of comes hand in hand with the WMD terrorism, because cyber terrorism can lead to WMD terrorism. If a super awesome hacker hacks a US governmental website, they can get onto our control panels for our nuclear weapons and possibly launch a weapon.
If you create accidental launch, you could also create miscalculation, right? Where people mistakenly think that something's being launched at them when it's really not, because you can jam their system, and so they respond in kind, right? They attack. The concept is that if you're getting attacked, you're going to fight back.
Exactly. One thing to keep in mind, there is a lot of literature on the US military attempting to have US hackers do this. And it's virtually impossible. This is something to keep in mind. I know, I looked into research for this, and the US employed awesome hackers. I actually know one of them. She's one of my friends. To try to hack governmental securities to launch a nuclear weapon. And there are so many fail-safes in our weapon systems that it's virtually impossible. So that's a lot of research to get into.
Fail-safe, write that down.
Switches.
When it comes to
Fail switches.
all cyber attacks, fail-safe is a good answer. It all sounds real pretty of how they would shut us down with things like our grid or ability to control our weapons, but we have a lot of things called fail switches, so how would they get past them? So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Jack?
Actually, I think the current dialogue, the most vulnerable system we have to a cyber attack would be our electrical grid.
Yeah, sure. One aspect, the electrical grid, the reason people say this also isn't very true as well are the same ideas of fail-safes. We have a lot of them. So moving on, in cyber terrorism, another fear for cyber terrorism is how the US would react if our system is being, infiltrated. We have a lot of fail-safes with other countries to be able to notify them immediately and find out where the attack is coming from. These are all defensive measures that keep a conflict that is cyber from escalating, which is a good answer to teams who are trying to make terrorism a huge reason to, vote for their side. If you can find reasons that it's just not true,